Sonia Massey, someone from Illinois, an unarmed black woman, was shot the other day in her home by a deputy sheriff. The deputy has since been charged with murder. You've said police would get immunity from prosecution if you win. Why should someone like that officer have immunity, in your opinion?
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to Southern Draw Law. My name is James White, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, former police officer. Of all the comments made on my channel over the past few months, 3 really stand out to me as kind of the most common things that people say. First, and definitely the most common, is some iteration of, James, you could have been anything, probably should have been a plus-size male model. Why did you decide to be a lawyer when everyone hates lawyers? And more specifically, why did you subject yourself to going on YouTube where people will not just hate your profession or hate you as a human being, but hate your specific face as you exist as a human being in the profession? Obviously joking here, but there really are a couple of consistently present comments that I see regardless of the videos that I post. And number one is that we must end qualified immunity. And number 2 is expressing some concern about the fact that Donald Trump has repeatedly said that he wants to expand police immunity in America. Now, before we go much further, I want to make it clear that this video will not be a political one. I recognize that half the country did not vote for Trump, and that means that at least half my audience, but by my estimation, much higher than that, because I do look at the comments on these videos, and I do understand that a large percentage of my audience did not vote for Trump. And as a result of that, many of you are experiencing genuine and raw emotions over the election, ranging from regular concern to anger to outright fear over what's going to happen over the next 4 years. And I understand that. I do understand what it's like to be on the losing end of, the party of choice. And because of that, the focus of this video will solely be on presidential authority over immunity without taking any political positions whatsoever. So I invite you to let your guard down and let's talk about the possibilities.
Immunity?
Immunity.
I don't know the exact case, but I saw something and it didn't look good to me. It didn't look good to me. Are you talking with the water? Right?
Yeah, well, police unions are not backing this person either.
Okay.
But again, why would...
They're going to be charging the officer. I guess they're charging the officer.
So why should he receive immunity?
Well, he might not. I mean, it depends. It depends on what happens. I'm talking about people that are much different cases than that. We need people to protect ourselves. And by the way, in Chicago, as an example, a few weeks ago, July 4th weekend, they had 117 shootings and 17 deaths. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. We need to have our police officers have the respect and dignity back. In this particular case, I saw something that didn't look good to me. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all.
So can you get a little more specific back to the immunity question? Who would make those distinctions?
Well, right now, for the most part, people are protected by their unions, by their police unions, or by their police departments. But I'm saying if I felt, or if a group of people would feel that somebody was being unfairly prosecuted because the person did a good job maybe with crime, or made a mistake, an innocent mistake. There's a big difference between being a bad person and making an innocent mistake. But if somebody made an innocent mistake, I would want to help that person.
What would those exceptions be? What would determine an innocent mistake?
You go after somebody and it's a very close call and it's very dangerous. And they have, the policeman's life and woman is a very difficult thing because sometimes you have less than a second to make a, life and death decision.
Now, you may recognize that clip from the beginning of the video as an event that Trump was invited to at a convention with the National Association of Black Journalists in Chicago back at the end of July. And this was right after the Sonia Massey murder. During that interview, he was grilled pretty intensely about his stance on giving police expanded immunity. Now, I'm not going to show any more Trump speeches during this video. That clip was only for reference because, quite frankly, I think whether you voted for him or not, reasonable humans can only handle so much of Donald Trump talking. But it is important that we understand what he said, and even more important that we dissect it. If you paid attention at all to what he said, you would have learned 2 things pretty quickly. Number one, Trump doesn't understand the legal doctrine of immunity. I say this because his response to the question about Sonia Massey was that he saw something that he didn't like and it didn't look good. And that indicates that he at least recognizes that these things have to be judged on a case-by-case basis. You can't immunize someone simply because of their status or their title. Well, unless you're the president of the United States, and then I guess you get immunity to do whatever you want, but that's a different topic for a different discussion for a different video. But the second thing that you might have realized, and that I realized by listening to his response, is that he doesn't actually mean what he says, which might not be much of a surprise to you. He makes it pretty clear that all he's doing is pandering to the pro-police, law and order crowd. And I'll explain that a little more by explaining presidential power over immunity. I'm going to be using some graphics here so I can kind of break up you having to look at me the whole time. But first off, there are really only two types of immunity. Number one, there's immunity from criminal prosecution, meaning that you can't be charged with a crime. And number two, there's immunity from civil liability, and that means that you wouldn't be civilly liable for money damages owed to someone who has sued you. Now, as far as the immunity from criminal prosecutions, Trump can actually have an impact on that, but not in the way that you might think. As I'm sure you know, the president can't just make law. The closest thing a president can do is use the administrative state and the power of the pen to accomplish things that sometimes have the force and effect of law, but come about by executive order. But a president doesn't have the authority to use executive order to override or negate a law that has been properly passed by Congress. So, how can he affect criminal prosecutions? Really, he can affect them in two ways. Number one, through his cabinet, he can use the Attorney General and directives towards the Attorney General to make sure that the DOJ doesn't try to prosecute police officers for federal crimes. And number two, he can use his pardon power to relieve someone already prosecuted from the consequences of the conviction they received from previously being tried for a federal crime. But he really can't have much of an impact with either of those options. See, there are very, very, very few officers that are prosecuted for violations of federal law. Most criminal prosecutions, as I'm sure you know, happen at the state level where individual prosecutors elected in their jurisdictions to prosecute the criminal cases have the discretion to bring about charges or dismiss charges or whatever. No one in the federal government has any discretion over the prosecution of state level crimes. So there really isn't much that he can do to impact federal criminal prosecution because these people would still be subject to prosecution on state crime. And to that point, officers who are prosecuted for federal crimes are almost always prosecuted at the state level. And when they are convicted on both levels, their sentences run concurrently, not consecutively, which means that they run at the same time. They're not, if this is one sentence and the consecutive sentence would be at the end, a concurrent sentence happens at the same time. So take Derek Chauvin, for example. Chauvin is convicted at the state level and he's serving a 20, give or take year sentence in the state of Minnesota. He's also convicted on federal level, right? So he's also serving a similar sentence at the federal level, but both of those run concurrently. They're not running consecutively. So it's the same 20-year period for both. So if Trump were to come in and try to pardon Derek Chauvin, it would not have any impact on his requirement to serve out his state sentence in Minnesota because the president can't pardon someone for a state crime. Only the governor of that state can do it. Now, I guess if you really want to push it down the rabbit hole, you could say, well, could Trump call up, say, some governor like Sarah Huckabee Sanders down in Arkansas, and somebody who used to work in his White House and put pressure on her to pardon someone for a state crime? I mean, sure, he could do that. But you have to understand that is using his individual influence. It's not giving the institution of law enforcement as a whole some privilege because they're police officers that will endure beyond the end of his presidency. And that's what we're really all concerned about. But what about civil liability? Well, he can't really do much to help cops with that either. You see, qualified immunity, as I'm sure most of you know, is a legal doctrine that was created sort of out of thin air through judicial activism. And it was done in a case from 1967 called Pearson versus Ray, and then it was modified slightly by another Supreme Court case from 1982 called Harlow versus Fitzgerald, and then again modified in 2009 by the holding in a case called Pearson versus Callahan. Now, all that means is that we have a 50-plus year history of case law supporting qualified immunity. Now, again, the purposes of this video is not to discuss the merits of qualified immunity, the good and bad. I would encourage you actually to check out a video that Bryan did on the Civil Rights Lawyer channel in 2022, laying out all of that stuff, because he really packed a lot of information in there that would help clear this idea of qualified immunity up quite a bit. And then at some point, I'll end up doing a series on the cases that we just mentioned that were sort of the American jurisprudence of qualified immunity, and we'll sort of explore it in more detail. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Trump can't really do what he's promised, even if he wants to. Seeking to hold an officer liable for a violation of civil rights comes from the federal law, and specifically 1983. So being that the right to seek damages comes from a properly enacted federal law, there are really only a couple ways that that can change. Number one, Congress would have to change the law, either to expand immunity or modify it in some way. Number two, the second way that it could happen would be that the Supreme Court could render a decision that would nullify some part of the federal law and expand qualified immunity, again through judicial activism. And that is potentially, with this particular Supreme Court, a possibility. But you see, in American jurisprudence, there's a legal doctrine called stare decisis, and that basically just means that the courts are sort of required to stand by the decision made by prior courts, and it takes a whole lot to overturn court precedent that's been relied on for decades. Now, we obviously just saw it happen with Roe versus Wade, so we know it's possible that that can happen, but it is extremely rare. Now, a case could come along that would cause the Supreme Court to expand qualified immunity. And like I said, that is a concern, particularly with this court, but that really doesn't have much to do with what Trump can do now, outside of the fact that he's the one that picked the justices and put them in place that are in the majority. But again, all of that was done before, and that would have been just as much a possibility had Kamala Harris won the election the other night, because again, the justices are already there from his first term. So either way, this term, Donald Trump can't do much with this because he just doesn't have unilateral power to expand qualified immunity or change existing federal law. Now, could Trump get enough support in the House and the Senate to pass a bill expanding immunity? In theory, yeah, he could, but I think it's very unlikely. For starters, it would kind of depend on the ultimate majority that Republicans have in the Senate and the House, which is as yet still undecided. In order to pass a bill into law, as I'm sure you know, you need a simple majority in the House and you need a simple majority in the Senate. Now, it's not clear at this point whether the Republicans will even retain control of the House, because when I looked last night, there were still 30-some races that have not been called, and Republicans had like a 206. They need 218 for the majority. And then, in addition to that, it's not clear whether they're only going to have the 52 vote majority that they have now, or whether they're going to pick up a couple more seats and end up with 54 or 55. The Senate could in fact do some damage in this space because, look, there are only 100 senators, whereas there's like over 400 House seats. And it's much harder to get elected to a Senate seat than the House because there's only 100 of them, and they serve 6-year terms instead of 2-year terms that their counterparts in the House have. That matters because once they're in there, it takes a lot to get them out. With, say, a 54 or 55 seat majority, there's a real chance of passing a good bit of any president's agenda, so long as the party of the president is aligned with the majority in the Senate. But the House is different. You're going to have a lot more moderates in the House, and they may have a political aspiration of some sort that makes them want to kind of stick around for a little while. Like maybe they want to run for senator, maybe they want to be on a presidential ticket someday. And because of that, they're much less likely to vote for something fringe or vote for something that would upset their voting base if their constituents are moderate or they're from like a purple area of the country. They don't want to do something to get themselves voted out in 2 years. You know, you can forget about what a senator did 6 years ago at the beginning of his term, because 6 years is a long time. But that's harder to do when we exist in sort of this constant election cycle, and the House members who were elected this year already have targets on their backs for the people coming for those seats in 2026. So in order to go to the president's desk for his signature, the bill would have to be approved by both houses of Congress. Is it possible? Absolutely. But there are a lot more things that I think are important to Trump than pleasing a group of people who are going to vote for him either way. There is zero chance that any of those pro-police, law and order people were voting for Kamala Harris, with the exception of maybe a few here or there. They're going to cross over basically only for abortion rights. So I just don't see it happening. In closing, I want to make this video part one of a two-part series, and I want the second part to be where I can go through and answer some specific questions that you guys have about qualified immunity. So what I'd like to ask you to do is to put your questions in the comments section, and I'll copy and paste them into a document, and over the next couple of weeks, I'll go about building a video where I try to explain those questions in detail if I can. But it should be noted up front that qualified immunity is a really complicated and really important issue, and it's not as simple as just saying, let's abolish it. Even if it was that simple, that wouldn't actually solve the problem. And that's, again, another expanded conversation for another time. But again, I would invite you to check out John Bryan's video on this, and I'll leave a link in the description. In that video, he explains that even in cases where qualified immunity has been stripped, and even where the cops have been fired or charged criminally, they almost never have to pay judgments. It's like literally half of 1% of the time. That's generally because the department indemnifies them through some insurance policy that covers them. They have like umbrella coverage over anybody working in, say, a sworn capacity in the department. And then couple that insurance coverage with qualified immunity, and police officers are sort of double insulated from having to pay anything. So even if they lose qualified immunity, they still get covered by the insurance policy. And so changing the way things are is going to require, some work on the insurance lobby, some underwriting changes that exclude specific conduct by police officers that violate constitutional rights. And then in addition to the underwriting changes, you're going to have departments who are invested enough, who believe enough in the change that they're willing to write those changes into their policy and procedure manual and hold their officers' feet to the fire as far as following it. All of that will be discussed more in detail later, but for now, man, I just wanted to come on here and do what I could to try to set your minds at ease for those of you who are anxious about the future. So I want you to remember this. You are an American. We are Americans. Most of us. I realize I have an audience that's outside of the country, but a good 95% of the people that watch my videos are here in America. We, as Americans, are strong. We are resilient, and we will endure this, just as we have every political cycle in history. We will experience the next 4 years together as Americans, and we will be standing together as Americans 4 years from now. Every election in the history of our country has left one side feeling the way some of us are feeling now. And though it may be just that I'm a perpetual optimist, which I am, I genuinely believe in the toughness and the grit of the American people. And that, my friends, includes you. So keep your chin up, keep grinding away to make your individual life better, and maybe it won't be as bad as you think it will. With that, I'll close this one out. Now, as sort of a recent development that I covered in a previous video, if you'd like to support the channel, I've decided against offering memberships on the YouTube platform, but I'll leave PayPal and Venmo links both here on the screen and in the description. If you can't afford to or don't want to contribute, please don't feel obligated. I don't expect anything from you, and I'm thankful for the support that you already give. Please remember to like and subscribe and leave your qualified immunity questions in the comments section. Check out some of the other videos on the channel and leave a comment on there as well. Until I see you again, take care. Always film your interactions with the police and keep your evidence to yourself.